What's up friends, today we are going to be building our biggest battery yet. In this box are 100 cells, 96 of which are going to be used to build a 12S 8P battery for a custom flux build. Stay tuned until the very end to see how it all turns out. Now, this is far from my first battery build, and if this is your first battery build, I would recommend probably starting with something a little bit smaller and then maybe moving to something like this a little further down the road. If you're interested in checking out some of my other battery tutorials on the channel, I've got those linked in the description, and then I will also be linking those up in the iCard. My most recent battery build was a small 10S 4P battery with 18650 cells, and I think that one is really interesting, so if you got some time afterwards, go ahead and check that out. Now, this battery will actually be quite similar to the 10S 4P 21700 cell tutorial that I did a little while back. You can check that out in the iCard as well. And we're going to be using a lot of the same techniques with some pre-cut nickel strips, some stranded copper wire for the series connections, and a very similar balanced lead layout. The only difference is this is way more than twice the size. Now, before we get into the build, let's go over a few small safety features. I'm not really sure what I meant there by saying features. I meant battery warnings. But anyway, there are a lot of things that come along with lithium-ion batteries. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I will not claim responsibility for anything you do with your batteries, as I've said in my other tutorials, but I will try to show you the best practices and give you a bunch of safety tips along the way. Now, in general, a lot of common sense comes into play here. You never want to puncture, overcharge, over discharge, place in a fire, crush, punch, do anything stupid to your lithium-ion cells. If you keep them away from heat and do things like that, you're probably going to be fine. And again, this is about respecting the batteries, not being afraid of them. Now, you might be wondering what these little safety tips are that I'll give you. Well, you're gonna have to watch the video because I'm gonna give them along the way to make sure you listen to all of them. Now, let's get on with the battery building steps. Like I mentioned earlier, this battery build is actually going to go very similar to the 10S 4P build that I did with these very same cells. We're going to start off by gluing all the cells together in their P group configurations, and then we will go ahead and wrap them in fish paper, place their fish paper rings on, tape them up, and then we will start by soldering the series connections. Series connections will connect all of the batteries together, and then we will move on to the balance wires, connect them up to the BMS, and then we'll clean it all up and wrap it up and get it ready to go in its final destination, which is in the flux enclosure on the flux custom build. All right, so now we're going to switch camera angles and we're going to get started by gluing all of these cells together. As we glue all these together, I will be measuring each one, which is a painstaking process, but always a good thing to do to make sure they're all within the same voltage range. All right, it's time to start gluing these cells together. Now, I have a lot of cells to glue here, and it's gonna take a while, but it's a pretty simple process overall. What I'm planning on doing here is lining up groups of 4P cells, gluing the group of 4P together, and then gluing it on the other side, and then we'll glue the next group, and then we'll stack them and we'll glue the ends. And I think that'll be enough to hold them together, and after that we'll put the fish paper around them and they'll be held extra secure. Now, as we do this, I'm going to go ahead and measure the voltage of each of them to make sure that they're within spec. It looks like this one is 3.542 volts. This next one is 3.541. This one is 3.540. And this one is 3.542. These are all completely within spec. If you have them within 0.001 of each other when they're new, that's perfectly fine. And let's just get started. It's gonna take a while, so I'm gonna do some time lapse here and maybe some cuts in between some of these cameras as well. Alright, so I just finished gluing together all of the battery cells, and you'll see some B-roll of that before this clip. But we've got all of the cells glued together, ready to be covered in fish paper, and I just went ahead and skipped the step where I cut all the fish paper because it's incredibly boring. We got 12 strips here to wrap around each of the different series groups, and I really hate cutting fish paper, so the next pack we do, we're going to be doing with an alternative to using fish paper to insulate your cells. But for this pack, we gotta use fish paper. So got that done. So the next step is going to be putting the fish paper rings onto the tops of the cells, which is actually kind of fun and satisfying. So I'll go ahead and play a little time lapse for you about that right now. As we start putting on all these paper rings, you probably are wondering about the gluing setup for these cells. Now, you would think gluing would be a super simple process, but there's one thing you have to remember when you're doing a fully staggered layout like these, and that is that you need to glue groups opposite each other. If you're going to have the groups going side by side, one group will have to be glued with them staggered towards the right side, and the other one will have to be glued with them staggered towards the left. Otherwise, you'll end up with a bunch of cells that are in the wrong direction. So make sure you lay them out like you're going to actually build with, and you won't have a hard time. Alright, we've now got all of the fish paper rings on top of all of our 96 cells. So it's time to wrap all of these groups up in their fish paper wrappings. And we'll go through this super quick so we can get moving on to the welding section. Alright guys, it is time to start welding this pack. We got all of our cells here laid out into 3 groups. These groups are going to go into the sections of the flux enclosure. So I've got them laid out like that. No particular good reason, but I've got a ton of welding to do. And I've got my welder set up here, plugged into my battery, set up next to my fan to keep it cool. And we've got our nickel strips. If you recall in my 10S4P battery video, we used some 21700 pre-cut 4P nickel strip from Duck Battery Systems, but this time we're going to be using 8P staggered pre-cut nickel strip from M-Boards. Now, some of you might know who M-Boards is, and the company has had a little bit of a rough past, but their goal nowadays is to provide speedy shipping on cheap quality items, and they definitely did that with these nickel strips. No one else out there that I could find has this exact setup, which is what I was looking for, and they shipped it to me in 2 days, so I really can't complain much about that. I paid for it, got it, and the product is good. So anyways, we're going to be using these 8P strips for this pack, and it's going to make it a lot easier than having to do a bunch of cutting for a pack of this size. So we're going to go ahead and get started on the welding, and I'll do a short montage here. I'm not going to record too much. You guys have already seen plenty of welding on my other videos, and this is pretty much exactly the same. So let's go ahead and get right into it.
when you're welding on the negative side of batteries like this, it's important to remember to avoid the 3mm circle in the middle where the internal spot weld connects the case of the shell to the internals. So while I'm welding on the back side here, the slots in the pre-cut nickel actually help me to avoid the center part of the cell. And as I go along here, go ahead and do the other 2 sets on each of these. Alright guys, so there's been a few things that have happened since the last clip. I believe this clip will be right after the spot welding montage, but I've done a few things in order to make this video a little bit shorter. I've cut all of my wires to size already and stripped the ends off to prepare for soldering, and I'll show you a little b-roll here of how it's laid out right now. But the plan for this pack is to have 3 12-gauge wires going through each of the different series connections. That should be easily good enough for 200 amps constant. I could have gone with just 2 actually, like on that 10S4P pack that I did in another video, but I wanted to future-proof just in case someone wanted to do 4-wheel drive on this for some reason in the future. But anyway, these 3 wires are easily good enough for 200 amps continuous, and probably even up to 250 with the wires getting a little bit warm. So we've got all these pre-cut, pre-stripped, and next step is to pre-tin all of them, and then pre-tin all of the pads on all of the batteries. And then I've got a lot of soldering to do. So we're gonna get started on that. I'm gonna pre-tin everything, and then I'll show a couple clips of soldering and stuff, but this part really isn't that interesting. And if you want to see this in more detail, go ahead and check out the 10S4P video up in the iCard. I did a lot more detail on the soldering portion on that video, and that's very similar to the setup that's going to happen here. So I'll talk a little bit over it, but not too much. Okay, so on here right now, I've got scored out my 6 solder points where these 3 wires are going to go. Now, each of these is going to get tinned quickly, and then I'm going to solder it right onto the pools, which I'm also going to tin in just a second. So we will tin these real quick and do these, and I'll just play it in fast motion. One of the things that comes up when I do things like this is that people say, oh, you shouldn't have too much heat on your cells. Yes, that is definitely true. However, my iron is very hot right now, and while one might think that that would make the cells hotter, what it does is, when used correctly, it actually helps less heat get transferred to the cells, because as you can see, I only have to hold my soldering iron on this joint for a second or two, and then it's solid. By keeping a hot iron and pre-tinning on both your nickel and on your wires, you're able to minimize the amount of time that the heat spends on the cells, and in turn have no ill effects. Now, one thing I should mention, of course, is that as soon as you start soldering cells together, you have to be extremely careful where you set things down, because as you build up potential, the voltage gets higher, and the stakes of misplacing something become much higher as well. So one thing for sure that I want to be careful of is that I never touch across a parallel group. Now, normally that wouldn't be an issue, but since these are so close to each other and we're soldering on top, you definitely have to be aware if you short across there, that's going to be a bad time. So just be aware of that. There you go. There is our 3 connections. These middle ones are going to probably look a little weird, but they're going to do their job just fine. And all the solder joints look good except for this one, so I'll add a little bit more to that one, and then we'll move on our way. Alright, as you will see in some B-roll shots, I have finished soldering together all of the series connections on this pack. Now, they look pretty good to me. Most of them came out nicely. I really wish that these bendy series connections came out a little bit better. The wires kind of kinked a little bit when I tried to bend them at this angle. They're not like crunchy or gonna break or anything, and I don't think the kinks will affect their performance at all, but I did wish they looked a little bit nicer. Other than that, it all went pretty smoothly. So next up, I'm going to solder on the charge port, and then we'll move on to all the balance wires, and after that we'll wrap it all up and finish it off. Okay, so this step we're going to be installing the charge port fuse, and for this we're going to need to attach to the positive on the battery, and I need to cut open a little bit of this Kapton tape which I placed on here so that I wouldn't accidentally short out the main battery leads. And we're just going to solder right onto this position. And then we will tape over it again in a couple minutes when I'm ready. Now this fuse here is in a fuse holder, and the fuse I have in here right now is a 30 amp fuse, which should be more than enough for any kind of high powered charger that might be used with this battery. I could have gone for a 10 amp fuse, but I thought 30 amp was more future proof, so that is what I've got in there. These fuse holders are great because they hold fuses in really tightly, and if you blow it, you don't have to desolder anything. You can just simply replace the fuse, so makes it a lot easier. And the main point of this is to be sure that in case you somehow short out the charge port by sticking a key in it or dropping a piece of metal in it or something like that, that your battery itself will be safe and it won't catch on fire or anything crazy. So we're just gonna go ahead and solder that on there. And there you go. So I'm about to solder on the charge port fuse to the charge port. And for this build, I'm using an SF12 connector on here, and you'll see it at the end, but it's a really nice connector, but the only thing is the housing is all plastic, so I have to be really careful when I solder this on. So I'm going to make sure that I pre-tin both this cable and the port really nicely so I can just touch it on there for a second and be done. Now, you also definitely want to make sure you have heat shrink on a connector like this because the cables are quite close together. All right, we got that on. Now we're just gonna quickly meld this together. And there we go. Only 2 or 3 seconds max of contact on there. Now we can slide over the heat shrink, which is adhesive filled. We'll slide that over, and that will both strengthen the connection and provide insulation against the negative one, which we need to solder to the B, or the P minus on the BMS? No, C minus. I don't know. I'll look at the diagram in just a second and make sure you guys know the right one. All right, so here we have got our BMS, and on here you can see that there are a couple of ports. There's P minus, B minus, and C minus. The one we're interested in right now is P minus. P minus is going to be going to the charge port minus, which is the other side of this SF12 connector. So we're going to be setting the BMS down probably in this orientation, and then we'll run the cable from the BMS to the to the negative on the charge port. I know this part is getting a little bit long, so if you're still paying attention, I do like to use 16 gauge fine stranded wire on the other charge port wires because it's super easy to solder, and the amount of heat transfer you get through it is pretty low, which means it's good to solder onto finicky ports. So we're using a bit of 16 gauge wire here of fine stranded copper wire, and that will be more than enough to carry the low amount of amps that will be coming out of the charge port. All right, so this is a little bit of a weird connection, but it should be pretty easy overall. I'm just gonna go ahead and get some flux on this cable. Then I think we'll grab my helping hands here to hold stuff together. And we're gonna be soldering onto the P minus here, like I said, with this cable from the charge port. Now, I want to go through the board a little bit. And really cover that connection pretty well. So we'll solder it from both sides, but we'll start with the top. And you want to make sure that this gets onto the actual pad, and once it does, you can kind of feel it suck down. And looks like we got a good connection there. As you can see here, because of the flux that I applied, we still got a good connection all the way through to the back. So this is pretty much done. Now the keen-eyed, or people that are familiar with battery building, will probably notice there's only a couple steps left. One of those is to connect the battery minus to the B minus on the BMS, and then do all of these balance leads, which I am definitely leaving for last. So let's do the B minus right now. Alright, so it is now time to wire up the BMS, and I'm going to put a diagram on the screen and stuff to help you guys, but this is the connector that we need to wire up to the pack. Now if you look at the BMS itself, you'll see on here that it says BC0 and BC15. Now that's the order you're going to wire the connector in. So BC0 will be your negative lead, and you'll count up from there. And because LLT sells a lot of different BMSs, they have a larger connector on here than necessary with a couple empty pins. But all you're going to do is just count up from the negative lead and go all the way up. So I'll show you guys as I connect it to the pack. Alright, so I got all of my balance wires aligned here, and I'm not going to go completely into the discussion of the balance connector again. There's a diagram that I'm going to put on screen that might help you figure out what wire is what, but it's pretty self-explanatory, counting up negative from the black all the way up to the positive. So the way I laid it out is -1, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then we have the positive wire. I might have miscounted there, but you get the idea. So our next step is to solder all the balance leads onto their respective positions. So we're just going to go ahead and do that. I should also mention that while I'm doing this, you need to be extremely aware of the fact that you have a ton of balanced short circuit locations here. If I were to drop something metallic like this across any of these cells, it would be very bad. So be aware of where your hands are, where your tools are, and what you're doing. In fact, the amount of current here can actually be felt if you have sweaty skin. So if you stick your hand across one of these groups and your skin is sweaty, there is a high chance that you're going to start feeling some burning. So be careful, be aware of how much power you've got under your hands, and just take that into consideration as you're working.
so as you guys can see, we have pretty much finished the pack. I have done quite a bit since I last talked to you, I think. I finished up all the balance wires, put glue down in all the important spaces, cleaned up some of the other areas, and pretty much finished all the rest of the cleanup except for putting on the heat shrink, which we are about to do. Now, as of right now, this pack is still quite dangerous, so make sure you don't have any rings on or anything like that. And yeah, let's get ready for a little bit of final cleanup on these terminals and then the heat shrink. At this point in the battery building process, I decided to heat shrink this pack, but it ended up not working out. And as you can see in the center of the frame, the cells are stagger stacked. And what ended up happening here is as the heat shrink compressed fully, it ended up skewing the cells up and down, either due to not being tightly taped enough or just due to the angles. So I ended up shrinking this on here and then cutting it right off, and you'll see in the next clip in a second when I put this into the enclosure. Additionally, the heat shrink at the ends of each group stuck out way too far, and I tried cutting some off, but it just wasn't going to be the fit and finish that I wanted. So in the next clip where I talk to you guys, you'll see that I switched to using Kapton Tape, and I think I talk about it a little bit here. All right, I don't know exactly how much of that heat shrink attempt I'm going to show in the edit, but yeah, it didn't work very well. You don't have to have heat shrink on every pack you make, but it does look good when it works. For this one, I'm just going to end up taping around all of the series areas with Kapton Tape, and that's just how it's going to be. There will not be any heat shrink to finish this one off, which is unfortunate, but it just was bending the pack in a really weird way, and it wasn't going to fit very well in the enclosure. So we're going to go with the tape solution. So I'm going to tape that all up right now, and we'll get some final B-roll of this and close it out. Alright guys, so I have pretty much finished up the battery here. I added a bunch of Kapton Tape to cover all of the series connections. I put a little bit of foam underneath the battery in the enclosure. I put some foam bits on top to help protect it from the deck. And I also configured the smart BMS. We're not going to go into the configuration of that. It's a little bit too much for this video, but that is all set up and the board is ready to charge. So on our smart BMS, we have this nifty little app, and on here I can see the voltage ranges of all the cells, and it will tell me that all the cells are nearly dead, because when you get new cells from the factory, they ship at around like 3.5 volts, which is pretty low capacity. So before using this, we'll go ahead and charge it out completely, but the pack is pretty much perfectly in balance since all of the cells are brand new and high quality. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this battery build. This was one of my biggest builds that I've ever done. My previous biggest was 12S7P. This is a 12S8P, so a little bit bigger, but it is a pretty awesome build. It came out really clean, and I think that the client is going to really like it in their future board. Now, I don't think I really have too much else to say. I'll let you guys end out the video with a little bit more B-roll of the completed battery. And yeah, other than that, stay safe, keep on riding, and peace out.